Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Now, usually people can hear me without a microphone. Can everybody hear me? Right, that's great. Then I won't use a microphone. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you, Charles. You've stolen half of my lines, but that's okay. Thank you very much, Dan, for your very kind words. It's a very great pleasure to be here back in Bishkek. I was here 3 years ago, almost to the day. It was the beginning of November, and that's when I first got to know something about Ololo, and it really is a very, very great pleasure to be back here again and to meet all of you, distinguished guests. And I'll say a bit more about this later, but I think it's especially a pleasure to be here at a time when, Daniel, forgive me if I get this wrong, but I think the association of creative industries is more or less new now. Is that right? I mean, this week. So, congratulations to everybody who has contributed to that. And I'll come back and say something more about why I think the association is very important. Let's see whether we can get this right. Right, okay. So I'm going to speak for about 20 minutes, 25 minutes, something like that. And just so that you all know where I'm hoping to go or planning to go in my remarks, to give them some kind of order, this is what I'm going to talk about more or less. I'll say just a little bit, no more than a word or two about myself. I'll say something about the expanding global market for cultural goods and services. Excuse me. I'll say a little bit about the funding models that you can find in the creative economy now. I'll say something about what I think any country needs to do to become more successful as a creative economy. And finally, I'll say something about what I think is the enormous opportunity here. So this is me. I have a rather kind of peculiar mixed life. I spend 2 or 3 days a week in investment business, and I work for a company which in particular is famous for investing in movies. That's one of our movies. Has anybody seen this film? The Life of Pi. I've put this one up here because it's something that I'm really proud of. It's now 8 or 9 years old. But the director, Ang Lee, won an Oscar for Best Director for this movie. But there is another reason why I've put this particular picture up. And it is because there is a growing theme in all discussions about creative, cultural and creative industries, and that theme is the interaction between creativity and technology. And this is just one example, already 10 years old, but 10 years ago when we financed this movie with 20th Century Fox, and we were working on this story, fantasy story, of course. 2 directors gave it up. They said it was impossible to make the film. The tiger is called Mr. Parker. And you won't be surprised to know that Mr. Parker is not a real tiger. It's very hard to act with real tigers. And so the point is that this is a computer-generated image tiger. Millions and millions and millions of images make up Mr. Parker, and that's why the film cost over $100 million to make. It's extremely expensive, but it's a great story, and it's one of the things that I'm really proud of. So I work in the film business on the financial side, and I also spend some time at Goldsmiths University in London. Goldsmiths has something called the Institute of Cultural and Creative Entrepreneurship. And at that university, in the institute, we try to do two things. We try to train the next generation of managers in cultural institutions, opera houses, art galleries, museums. We try to encourage them to be more intrapreneurial. Have you heard that word? It's what an entrepreneur does if he's stuck or she's stuck inside a big organization. Try and teach them to be more intrapreneurial. And then we also work with people who want to be creative entrepreneurs, and it's a very practical approach. Everybody who comes to Goldsmiths will be expected to make some progress starting their own business. So two quite different worlds, but the reason why I do all this work at Goldsmiths is that I find it extremely, it's very fulfilling to have an opportunity to try to share some of the things that I've learned in business and pass them on. So this is me, and my background, therefore, you may say, bridges the world of creativity, education, and finance. Now, this creative economy stuff is pretty new. We only really started talking about it in the 1990s, and the idea of an economic sector called the creative industries, or the cultural and creative industries, originated mainly in the UK, also in Australia. I don't quite know why that was, but the idea really only dates from the 1990s, and in particular the late 1990s, when our culture department, which is called the Department of Culture, Media and Sport, started to think about this part of the economy, which included the old arts and culture sector, opera houses, classical music, museums and so on, but also included the dynamic parts of the entertainment industries, video games, film, television, and we started to think in the UK about how they interacted with each other to create a dynamic part of the economy. And so a lot of work was done at that time, but the thing that really changed, the event that made the creative economy a really big subject on the global stage was this report. In 2010, the UN, United Nations, UNCTAD and UNDP published this report called Creative Economy, and some of the things that you will find in that report I've listed here were extraordinary. But the most extraordinary thing that was disclosed by this report is that what we call the creative economy had been growing much faster than anybody thought. It had been growing since about 2000 at something like 7 or 8% a year. It even continued to grow during 2008 when some of you may remember there was a global financial crash, and the global economy fell in size or contracted in size by 5 or 6% in a year, even during that time, there was strong evidence that the creative economy was growing, particularly in the South, as I say here. There is a lot of stuff that is still worth reading in that report. But I want to go back to it because what I have highlighted on the left of this slide is extremely important. It's always interesting to look at how the cultural and creative sector is doing in other countries. And later this week, I may possibly be talking about what's happening in Slovenia and the great success story in Morocco and what's happening in Brazil, maybe the EU. Slovenia, which is a similar sized country to Kyrgyzstan, has a very interesting creative economy. But this was one of the key conclusions of the report published in 2010, and it remains, I think, critically important for everybody, including everybody in this room, I think, to take note of. What UNCTAD said was each country is different, each market is special, and each creative product has its own specific touch and splendor. Nonetheless, each country might be able to identify key creative industries that have not yet been exploited to their full potential, so as to reap developmental benefits. That's certainly true here, as I think we'll discover. There is no one-size-fits-all prescription. Each country should formulate a feasible strategy to foster its creative economy based on its own strengths, weaknesses, and realities. And I think that's a crucially important thing. We can learn, we can be inspired by what's happening in other countries, but we must always do what particularly works and what is right and appropriate for, in this case, of course, Kyrgyzstan. That is not to say that it is anything other than interesting, always instructive to look at what's happening. You can always get inspiration from what's happening in other countries. And the organization that has done more to focus attention on those matters, how it's done in Brazil, how it's done in Kenya, how it's done in the Russian Federation, has for a long time been the British Council. The British Council has, more than any other organization in the world, popularized the notion of the creative economy. And you can see that that was one of its early reports. You can see available in Russian. That report came out in 2010. That was the beginning, really, of the British Council's program of work in this area. It has been updated 2 or 3 times. You can find it on the internet. There are some wonderful ideas in there. As I say, you can always get inspiration from what other people are doing, but in the end, you have to do your own thing. Now, I'm not going to spend too much time on this. I mean, there are different ideas about exactly how you define cultural and creative industries, and it depends what kind of classification you want to use, but classification is a rather tedious subject, so I won't spend much time on it. But it is worth just reflecting on the definition, which, as I said earlier, the UK was responsible for initially back in 1998 in what was called its first major mapping exercise. And it defined the creative industries as those organizations which have their origin in individual creativity, skill, and talent, and which have a potential for wealth and job creation through the generation and exploitation of intellectual property. And that 20 years later remains the working definition for our sector. Let's, however, come at this from a slightly different direction. Just think for a while about culture itself. A friend of mine, whose name is Pier Luigi Sacco, who is an Italian academic who teaches at Harvard University in America and at the University of Padova in Italy. Pierluigi has come up with this kind of concept of how the idea of value creation has changed. And I think it's kind of an interesting way to think about it. He talks about culture 1.0, culture 2.0, and culture 3.0. And it's basically it takes kind of a long historical view. But it's an interesting thing to do before you start thinking in more detail about business models. So what he says is that, culture 1.0 was essentially very straightforward. Everything that happened before the 19th century culture was paid for, on the whole, by patrons, bishops, princes. It didn't exist really as an idea in commercial terms. It was very simply a matter of being in with the right bishop or prince, and that was more or less true anywhere. Of course, there was a crafts market, but it was extremely local, and cultural goods didn't travel very far. And then that all changed, of course, in the 20th century when what Pierluigi calls culture 2.0 comes on the scene. And that's characterized above all by the industrialization of the entertainment sector. So the film industry, TV industry, then the games industry. And this period is characterized by the growth of mass audiences, the idea of industrial process, CDs, records, and so on. And it's also characterized by the development of the idea of intellectual property and copyright, and the other side of that coin, piracy. By the way, I showed you that image of the life of Pi, one of 600 odd films that we financed. Avatar was another. We, as a business, lose millions of pounds every year because of piracy. Because there is stuff that we have put out there which is available on the internet and, to be blunt, can be stolen and is stolen in large quantities. It's a kind of criminal activity. But the problem is that our great advances in technology, and in particular the internet, have made this activity very much more easy. Because what is the internet? The internet is one vast, great copying machine. It's extremely effective at it. From that point of view, technology has created difficulties for some of us who work in the film and related industries. And then Pierluigi says, when you get to the 21st century, you begin to see that the background, the economic structure, the commercial modus operandi of creative businesses, creative enterprises is changing radically yet again. And we begin to see the dominance of big platforms like YouTube and Facebook, and of course the big Chinese platforms. You see a growing focus on the idea of co-creation, and you find this in particular in the world of games, but also in the world of publishing. The idea that some people want to create their own stories based on stories which have already been written and share online with all their friends. That leads to what some people call prosumer ecosystems, where creative ideas are being developed both by professionals and consumers at the same time, interacting with each other online. You have crowdfunding models and so on. So you can see that the idea of the creation of value changes completely through this period of time. And I think it's worth reflecting on that when you begin to think about, well, what are the business models? What are the business models which are now out there in the world of the creative economy? Because actually, what you have now is new business models coexisting with very old business models and interacting in all sorts of extraordinary ways. So, to be clear, old style patronage, the giving of money to artists to do stuff, write operas, paint things, create sculptures, that's all still there, believe me. Traditional state subsidy, that's all still there, although it's getting smaller and smaller in most countries. That's true pretty well everywhere. Actually, there's one exception. In Norway, it's getting higher, but they've got lots of oil and they're still selling it. Corporate sponsorship is a very important source of revenue or contribution to the creating of stuff for many artists and producers. You've got traditional advertising, you've got new online advertising. This world is extremely complicated. And actually, one of the reasons why politicians find it quite hard to understand the creative economy is because it is so complex in terms of all of these different business models and ways of generating revenues and earning stuff. It's much more complicated. Everybody understands what what the pharmaceutical industry is. It's all about research and development and making drugs. I mean, it's fairly simple. But the creative economy is really quite complex in terms of the financial and business models that coexist and interact with each other. And the other great distinguishing characteristic, of course, is that unlike many other industries, the creative economy is absolutely dominated by what we call micro companies, micro enterprises. They're not even small and medium-sized companies, right? The typical definition of an SME is that it's between 25 and 200 people. Let me tell you how the creative economy is structured in the UK. This will just give you complete sense of what I'm trying to say. We in the UK have around 290,000 creative businesses, right? Just a bit less than 300,000. Of those companies, 95% employ 10 people or less. Of those companies, 90% of companies employ 4 people or less. And that gives you an idea pretty fast that the vast majority of our businesses employ 2 or 3 people, okay? And then actually it gets even more distinctive and unique than that if you concentrate attention on audio-visual, say film and television. In the film industry in the UK, 70% of people are self-employed. They're freelancers. They're not on anybody's payroll. They sell their time on a project basis. They work on a movie, then they work on another movie, then they work on another movie. And of course, you know, for governments everywhere, this is kind of difficult to get your head around. So it's not surprising that many governments are slow to see the potential that the creative economy has, because it's just harder to get your head around what's really going on. I've written down a few things here that I think it's worth saying in the context of Central Asia in general and Kyrgyzstan in particular. I've tried to ask myself, what are the conditions that you need to grow a creative economy? What is required to make the success of the sector? And these are just a few of my thoughts about this. First of all, and probably the most important thing, and this is what the UK did 20 years ago, is there has to be a change of mindset, a change of way of thinking, way of looking, from what I would call an industrial to a post-industrial knowledge-based economy. You know, motor cars are great, but we're not going to be making so many motor cars in 20 or 30 years' time, I don't think. The knowledge-based economy is going to be where the growth is, and the first thing that governments need to do is to try and understand that. And I think we did succeed in the UK in getting to grips with that idea about 20 years ago, and many other countries have followed suit. The idea that the cultural and creative industries, that's the EU term, by the way, CCIs, the idea that the CCIs can be a key driver of economic growth is something that I think we are even only now just beginning to understand. And here's the kind of complexity in it. It's not just that what creative businesses do is important in itself. So the games company creates a game which sells and makes money, right? The theatre company puts on a show which attracts people into the theatre and helps to sustain a kind of theatre economy. That's all true. But what we are now beginning to understand, and why I think co-working spaces are so interesting from this perspective, is that even in the economy outside the creative economy, lots of activity that produces growth is generated by the interaction with creative people. And that kind of wider concept of the creative economy, I think, is very interesting. If you build submarines, you still need designers, right? You need people to design stuff. You need creative people to work in parts of the economy that are not normally thought of as creative. And we're just beginning to get a much better sense of that. And the reason why co-working spaces are so interesting, of course, is that what it creates is an environment in which all kinds of serendipitous interaction can take place between people who are in kind of different disciplines. It helps to think in new ways. It helps to see problems in a different way, to get a new perspective on things. That's why I think the future is much more with spaces like this than with a traditional kind of form of industrial building. So changing the mindset. Of course, you need advanced infrastructure. if you haven't got 3G, 4G, 5G, then a lot of the stuff that is happening now is going to be difficult to run efficiently. I think you need a government which is committed to free and diverse cultural expression. I'm not familiar enough with this country to know whether it passes that test or not. But I have no doubt that those countries where governments try to suppress free creative expression will find it, as they do now, more difficult to grow their creative economies. One of the things about creative talent is very mobile. And if people don't like the environment in which they're living, they're free to go somewhere else. And so having an environment, a milieu, to use the French word, a cultural milieu, which encourages creativity, which encourages experimentation, encourages research and development, encourages innovation. That's crucial to the future of creative economies. And then let me just stop finally on this point here, the critical role of independent representative structures. And I'll come back to this point about the creation of the association here in Kyrgyzstan, the Association of Creative Industries. I think this is a crucial moment. All creative economies need what you can best perhaps describe as intermediary bodies. You need bodies that can operate as networks. You need people who are organizers, who are capable of bringing people together, of making arguments, devising arguments, presenting arguments, lobbying government. The role of those organizations is crucial. And therefore, from this point of view, I think that the birth of the association is a key moment for the future of the creative economy in this country. I'm going to close now, but I'm going to close with just one. Charles, I'd be very interested to know, I'm sure there isn't an official line on what I'm just about to say, but it's kind of an interesting geopolitical, if I may, perspective against which to think about this idea of the creative economy here. There is a man in the University of Oxford called Peter Frankopan. I don't know whether any of you have ever come across Peter Frankopan, but he's written Daniel has. He's written two fascinating books. The first book that he wrote was just called Silk Roads, and it was actually a history of the world written from the perspective of the axis that goes up through what we know as the old Silk Roads from Iran up through to China and Russia. But what was different about it was that he told the history of the world from the perspective of somebody living on the Silk Roads. That's not how most history books have been written in the West, as you may imagine. Then he wrote another book, which came out about 2 years ago, which is called New Silk Roads. And what Professor Frankopan does in this book is that he suggests that the 21st century is going to be the Asian century. I think that's not very controversial, but he goes beyond that to say that he thinks the key axis for doing business going forward, or one of the key axes, is going to be the axis that runs from Turkey and Iran through to China and Russia and goes right through the middle of Central Asia. And that therefore we may expect the volume of trade, including the trade in cultural goods and services, to increase. What he actually says in his book is all roads used to lead to Rome, now they lead to Beijing. I'm not going to ask you to comment on that, Charles, but it's an interesting kind of thought. So I'm going to stop now. I've talked at much too great a length, but I hope I've said enough to communicate the fact that I think that there is a very bright future for what let us call creative Kyrgyzstan. I think there is a great opportunity to grow this sector of the economy. It's quite small at the moment. I mean, the guys at DAI will tell me if I've got this wrong, but it's only about 1% of the economy, in terms of either of GDP, gross domestic product, or gross value added, or whatever measure you want to apply. It's about 1%. So that is against a European average of 3 or 4%, or 6 or 7% in the UK. So what does that tell you? It tells you there is enormous scope for growth. There is enormous potential for growth. And I think this is the way forward for a country which has lots and lots of very skilled young people who want to build a future for themselves here. There is a future in the knowledge economy. There is a future in the creative economy. And I hope that I will be able to discuss that with some of you later on. Thank you very much for listening. And of course, I'm very happy to answer any questions or comments or criticisms that you may have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, dear Dr. Martin Smit, for your inspirational and very encouraging lecture. We have learned a lot. Each of your slides also had very important messages for us, for each of us. And here tonight, the density of creative people and creative leaders is very high. You mentioned about staying together, that we need to keep together and to learn from each other, to encourage